Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Altispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour. To be a part of the program, it is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. It's 1-855-450-6624. The email, live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. Joining me, my co-host, Mr. Steve Ovens. Welcome in, sir.
Good evening, Noah. I guess we kind of have a little bit of a morbid email to kick things off with this week.
Oh, my goodness. Do we ever? Let's get into it. Our first email comes in from Michael. Michael writes in and says, "Hi, Steve and Noah. I'm a big fan of open source and self-hosting. When I was first married, I used an old computer to host my own email server. I've hosted various things over the years, but that all came to an end when my wife asked a single question. If you were to die, how would I manage all this stuff? By trade, I'm a systems administrator or DevOps engineer. I know how to set up self-hosted apps. I know how to manage them. I know how to update them. I can support them, and I can automate them. My wife, on the other hand, well, she uses the technology, but she has no idea how to do anything outside of general computer use. So the question I have for you is the following. When setting up a self-hosted piece of technology that becomes a critical piece of your family's digital life, what's the plan if you die? And your significant other, who isn't trained, nor desires to be trained, how do they maintain the system? I'd love to do it all, but I keep thinking, what would happen to her data and her tools if I wasn't around to maintain it? I love what you do. Thanks for the great podcast, Michael." So, Steve, this is, I'm going to go ahead and say it. I think it's a bit of providence here because you've been working on this recently.
Kind of accidentally on purpose. Obviously, you take intention with this, but a couple of weeks ago, I started thinking through this very subject, thinking about all the things that I run in my, home lab is not actually what it is. When you're up to I have 4 virtual hosts, when you're up to 4 virtual hosts, a NAS, a backup server / backup NAS, 10 gig switch, 48 port, you get the point.
The Ovens data center.
It's probably not a home lab anymore.
Right.
So I was starting to think about, honestly, there's a few things that are very important to my wife. Home Assistant, Mealy, and honestly, Frigate. And those things,
I'm sorry. I can't. I'm going to have to do this. You got to tell us why Frigate, because the answer's so funny that I chuckle every time I hear it.
We have chickens, and she likes to watch her chickens in the chicken coop.
And
not just watch. She goes back into history. So she saw one yesterday. This is no word of a lie. This is a true story. Yesterday, she fired up the camera as she does, and she looks in there, and there was just a chicken that was sitting at the bottom frame of the camera, and she's looking at it. She's like, "I wonder how long that chicken's been sitting there." I don't know why you would think that, but she thought that. And so she started scrolling back through the history in Frigate, and she went back to the point, it was like the day before. She's like, that chicken's been there for 9 hours, just hanging out. It was fine. It went outside and stuff, but she sees little things like that, and I wonder what happens. Or she'll go into the backyard camera. We've got one in the coop that faces out into the yard. Mm-hmm. And she'll just be like, "I wonder what happened last night." And she'll just scroll through the timeline until she gets bored and walks away. And she really likes that. Likes that feature.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. So there are some things that are just absolutely essential in the Ovens household, Frigate being one of them.
Yeah. And so I've tried to ask her if she wants to learn how to do this stuff. She's not a Luddite. She is fairly technically competent. In fact, funny aside, she often plays technical support for her Bible group, which I find is kind of humorous. But at any rate, so she's not a Luddite or anything like that. And but she's never really shown any particular interest. Not that she couldn't do it. She just is not interested in even doing automation for Home Assistant. She'll just say, I'd like it if this thing did that. Okay, I'll go do that. So our strategy would be call Noah or maybe call one of my other tech savvy friends. And that led me down the path of like, okay, well, how do I actually make sure that somebody can understand how things are laid out here? So I went through a multi-day process of doing things like I dumped my Unify config. I dumped my Pi-hole config. I dumped all the things, including getting an IXE, which is like a little tool that gives you the hardware readout on individual servers and all that sort of stuff. And I kind of gathered all of that. And I started making documentation. And I used a local LLM and then said, hey, here's all this stuff. Can you start making me some diagrams? I specified draw.io diagrams. And so it did a fairly decent job. I'd say it got me about 80% of the way there, which whenever you're looking at a task that seems kind of daunting, when you're starting with something instead of nothing, it is always easier to move forward on that.
Do you have a suggestion for what LLMs work well for feeding information in and saying, hey, gives me a diagram?
I don't think that there's a specifically good or bad LLM for this type of stuff. Well, okay, that's not true. I hate Gemini. I hate Gemini with a passion. Gemini is terrible. Don't use Gemini. It is by far the worst one that I've ever used. It'll lie to you more often than not. Anyways, that aside, most LLMs that you can run are capable of processing text, right? So you're not interested in ones that can, tell you who ran for office in 1974, whatever it is. But almost all of them are capable at doing text transformation. That's one area that all LLMs they really shine at. And so when it's like, here's a bunch of my stuff, can you summarize it for me? Or here's a bunch of my stuff, can you make a table out of this? That's when you're not asking it to do any kind of reasoning, but just, hey, I have data in one format, please transform it to another format. Most of them do phenomenal at that. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here.
1-855-450-NOAH. It's 855-450-6624. The email live@asknoahshow.com. So a couple things stand out to me with Michael's email, Steve. So the first is when he says she has no desire to be trained. Right there, that jumps out at me off the page like big red flashing lights, right? If she has no desire to be trained, what I take from that is if you passed away, if something happened to you, she'd have no interest in maintaining that. She may want the thing that is there, but she doesn't want to do the work and or have the thing to maintain it. That then leads me down this path. If I was to put into place a piece of technology that any competent technical nerd could step in and pick up, what would that be? Well, I'll tell you what it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be something that was burdened with a bunch of licensing fees or had a bunch of things buried into it. It'd probably be something that is only designed with the concept of anybody can use this, anybody can download this, anybody can get access to this, any nerd can go set it up in his or her basement and play with it and get comfortable with it and understand it and read documentation about it and all of these things. When I start to try to put all of that together, then I get to, okay, open source. Open source lends itself to all of those things. To the extent that there is stuff that you feel like your wife couldn't live without, I might document those things like Steve did, and then you've set her up for success. If something happens, she can reach out to somebody, she can decide in the moment. This is going to sound weird, but having experienced loss myself in the fairly recent past, I can tell you for me, it was hugely helpful to dig into stuff, to have stuff to occupy my mind. I don't know, maybe that'll be a thing that like, hey, I'd never cared about this before, but now I can kind of explore how my husband's, mind works. Like Steve opened the segment saying it's kind of morbid to think about, but maybe that works for you, maybe it doesn't. If nothing else, at least you can go ask for the friend, a friend that is a nerd, or you can hire a nerd and have them come in and kind of step into the situation and see if they can kind of dig their way through it. But giving documentation or giving all of the things necessary that they can kind of recreate or figure out how the thing is set up, that is probably your best bet. I will tell you what we do in our house. In our house, for the most part, we have a very clear demarcation of here's the stuff that will work, Here's the stuff that we know will be available and that we count on and those sorts of things. And then here's everything else. The stuff that is absolutely imperative, essential, is stuff that my wife at least tangentially understands how to maintain. She would know how to update it. She'd know where it is. She would know what the IP address is. She knows the credentials. Could she do things like take the thing apart, upgrade the drives, put all the data back up, put all the stuff back on? I don't know. But she has enough of a fighting chance of here's how the thing works and here's how it's set up that I'm confident she could go get the right people involved to do that. Here's the other thing to consider. When I was reading through your question and I was trying to process, one thing I'll do is I'll take things to an opposite extreme to see if they make any more sense. And so if I take it to the opposite extreme, so if you put your wife on or your family on, Google Workspace or Office 365, do you believe that if you passed away that everything would be maintained and be available to them? Well, as the Cloudflare outage hits half the internet today, I'm going to go ahead and say, no, you couldn't be, that wouldn't give you any guarantees either. Licensing could change, pricing could increase. They could just decide to cancel your plan because they don't want to do business for you for this reason or the other. They could go out of business. There's all manner of things that could take them out of play as well. So I don't know that that's any better than having it home or self-hosted. In fact, again, home self-hosted at least gives a nerd following in your footsteps a fighting chance. Whereas if you're just reliant on some service, you are going to be at their mercy. What do you think, Steve? Does that resonate with you?
I mean, you're preaching to the choir as someone who's invested literal thousands of dollars in hardware.
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. So hopefully that helps. Documentation is really helpful. It's probably not a bad idea to have a nerd friend. So Steve and I both maintain friendships with other people that have similar interests and similar software values, if you want to call it that. And so, and obviously both of our wives are familiar with who those people are and how to get in contact with them, that sort of thing. And so I think some of those things will potentially really help you if you get down kind of a bad spot. Scott Jenson, he is a UX UI designer, and I'm going to invite Scott Jenson in to tell us a little bit more about his role.
I'm a product strategist, and I basically do design consulting for Mastodon and Home Assistant.
You gave a presentation talking about UX design, and you were pushing people to color outside the lines. What does that mean?
I believe that so many technology people right now are just getting the status quo. They're just happy with where they are, and there's a certain feeling like things have stabilized. And if we really want the world to get better for people, we really want to solve problems for users, we probably have to color outside the lines a little bit and push on some of these assumptions that we think are established.
Talk to me about this idea that mobile is dominant, mobile has won, and so the desktop is just for everybody else that is kind of stuck in their ways, but real professionals have moved on to mobile first.
Well, there's a lot of people that say that mobile won, and we should just move on from there. But if you take a look at any high-end organization, they're not typing their big CAD packages onto a phone, right? They're using a desktop with a big screen and a large keyboard and a tablet and all sorts of stuff. So people misunderstand how powerful the desktop is and how it's used for real work. So I'm just trying to say let's appreciate that and realize that mobile is excellent, primarily at consumer level things, and we kind of don't appreciate how awesome the desktop is and how much more it can grow.
Where do you think the shortcomings in the current desktop UIs are?
A lot of it is that we just assume that it's just windows and icons and applications. And the idea that the operating system can actually do more for you could be a more interesting clipboard, could be a more interesting history monitor. Now that we're going to be having effectively local small language models that could actually do more interesting things safely for you locally, ethically, that I think the computer can start being quite a helpful thing to us in a way that is very privacy preserving and much more than just simply opening windows and throwing away things in the trash can.
Do you think there's more of an opportunity for people in the open source world to improve UX design, or do you think that isn't where their focus should be because it would cost too much money, it would be too resource intensive?
Open source is a very big tent, and there's lots of organizations that are doing excellent UX, and I really want us to kind of call them out, kind of like as the Apple of open source. I want to call out really positive companies like Audacity or PenPot, because they are clearly showing the way that you can be open source and great UX. I think a lot of small projects are just a little overwhelmed, and they don't know how to use UX, and they often give the UX community an unfortunate negative opinion about UX because they don't have time for it. That's not their fault. They're small. But since there are companies or groups that are doing it, we should really celebrate them.
Where do you think some of the shortfalls or pitfalls are from UX or UI designers? Where are maybe opportunities for them to grow?
UX designers? Well, a lot of the industry has grown very quickly, and we've brought a lot of UX designers in through boot camps and so forth. So we have a lot of what I'd call novice UX designers. They mean well, but they don't have a lot of experience. And so you do need to be able to work well with programmers. You need to be careful what you say. You need to back up what you say, and you need to have good communication skills. And so there have been some, shall we say, more novice designers that haven't really made us look as good as we could. And I think that the more experience that we have, the better this will get.
What role do you think there is for UX designers to be paying attention to, or maybe I should phrase it this way. How important is it for UX designers to understand and be able to articulate the business use case and the business value to improving UX design?
Well, just that. Just appreciate the business case. And again, open source doesn't always care about business, but you do have to care about resources, and do you want to ask the programmers to throw everything away and start over again? And so sometimes what you need to do is have that little calculation of, well, what's a small hack we can do that gets us 80% of the way there versus throwing the whole thing away and taking us 6 months. Now, obviously that depends, and sometimes the example I like to give is Audacity actually threw everything away and started over, and it took them a long time, but they understood the reason for doing that, whereas sometimes you can do a small little thing. So the answer is it depends, as always, but UX designers need to be working with the team to say, what can we do? And frankly, the teams need to be willing to kind of also give them a little bit more energy to do maybe a little more than a quick hack. So it all boils down to team building and discussion and trying to figure out what's the right decision for your project right now. I wish I could give you a magic answer, but it really does depend.
Talk to me about InkSwitch. I'd never heard of them before you bringing it up, but it was fascinating to me. What is it for somebody who hasn't heard of them?
It's Ink and Switch, and they are a nonprofit research group, and you go to inkandswitch.com, and I think they're doing fantastic work, and they're really leading the way to do cost-effective, small, open-source research. They're primarily focused on CRDTs, which sounds very technical, but it's a very cool document technology, and definitely check them out.
Scott Jenson, product strategist, and a guest this hour on the Ask Noah show. Scott, I appreciate the time as always. We'll get you back in the program soon.
Thank you.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of November 16th, 2025, here's the Linux and open source news. Nano 8.7 has been released. Thunderbird 145 is now available, as is Firefox 145. Wine 10.19 ushers in Linux next leap for Windows app support. Proton 10.0 is now available. The KDE team has announced the release of KDE Frameworks 6.20. In distro news, Sparky Linux 8.1 is now available. Debian 13.2 is out. Tails 7.2 has been released. And Nitrix 5.0 is now available. In security news, Russian antivirus maker Kaspersky rolls out new products. A basic plan for Linux starts at $59 a year. A logic flaw in Avahi's simple protocol server ignores the configured client limit, allowing any user to open unlimited connections and exhaust memory and file descriptors, causing a system-wide denial of service for MDNS and DNS-SD. An RCE flaw in Immunify AV puts millions of Linux-hosted sites at risk. CISA warns of Akira ransomware Linux encryptor targeting Nutanix VMs. And Kraken ransomware has expanded its attacks to Windows, Linux, and VMware ESXi systems. In open source AI news, Weibo's new open source AI model, VibeThinker 1.5 billion, outperforms DeepSeek R1 on $7,800 of post-training. Eric Schmidt says that he worries that most governments will use Chinese AI models. And Databricks co-founder Andy Konwisky also reiterated that the U.S. must go open source with AI if it wants to beat China.
Things you didn't realize you knew and you took for granted about Linux. Steve had I'm going to say a wonderful experience, although I'm sure there were points of frustration that caused him to reevaluate what he knew about Linux and what he took for granted. Tell me that story, Steve.
So I suppose it goes back to the ongoing saga of whenever you're helping a friend or a relative or someone like that who is attempting to get into the Linux ecosystem, either through your own prodding or through stuff that they found on your own. Mm-hmm. In this case, someone that I was helping went out and decided that Garuda Linux was for them, and they installed it on their computer and then started asking questions, which is good, right? We want to encourage questions and help people along. Now, this person is the mythical new user. It is a person who has used a computer for a significant period of time, has a bunch of knowledge built up in the Windows world. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, when we say mythical new user, oftentimes we think of someone who's never seen a computer before or are so impressionable that, we just need to cater to them. We basically need to give them the Fisher-Price version of a computer, right? That seems to be the way that we think about the mythical new user. In this case, what we actually find is someone who is motivated enough to go out and, first of all, discover Garuda Linux, because it's not like when you search in which version of Linux should I be running on the internet, that does not filter anywhere near the top of the list. So how we came to that decision is beyond me. Mm-hmm. And that's not a knock against Garuda, just simply like, I don't know how that bubbled up to the top. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Sure.
And so there's a base of knowledge of how Windows works, how you install drivers, how the firewalls, all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. In the several months that I've been helping this person, not once has there been a why doesn't my start menu look like Windows? It's never been, why doesn't Dolphin look like the Windows file manager? Or why don't I have my task manager? I'm sure those types of questions exist, but in today's day and age, everybody has access to all kinds of things, and we don't expect them to have the same UI. A phone, a tablet, your silly TV, your VCR, the PlayStation, you can rattle off on and on and on, all of these things that have different interfaces. And this idea that we need to customize the interface in order for people to be able to use a computer, I don't think that's valid anymore.
Okay. So
going through this process, we end up stumbling over things that we kind of take for granted. So I'll give you a pretty easy one for most people to understand. He went out and bought an AMD graphics card and installed it, and everything seems to work fine. But doing the Windows related thing, he went to go download the drivers. But they don't offer drivers for Arch Linux because the AMD card is built into the kernel. Well, so he sees, they've got a Debian one and they've got a RHEL one, and basically the packages they have available for download are the kernels that are probably old enough that they don't have that built in. And that led me to you have this moment of introspection of your first reaction might be, why don't you know that? But for me, it was more along the lines of thinking about how do I help this person? I come to the realization that why should they know that information? Why would they know that this thing that they've done for the last 15 years, go on the AMD website, click on download driver and all that sort of stuff? Why would they know that would be different? Right. And that's one of those things. It's like, I didn't go out to learn that. I picked that up somewhere along the way. And there's just a whole raft of things from the way the file system works. Who doesn't think about file systems? Mac users and Windows users.
Yeah.
Why? because there really isn't much of a choice. It just is what it is.
That, and
Right.
let's face it, like nobody cares about that stuff unless you are into it, or when you start having a problem. Then all of a sudden you care because you want to figure out why it doesn't work.
Exactly. But you know what is very confusing to people? When you give them Btrfs as the default file system, then you create a .snapshot directory, which they didn't create themselves. And then the .snapshot directory says it has a whole terabyte worth of stuff, but then your file system utility says you've only used 40 gigs. Talk about confusing.
Yeah.
Right? And so as I was working through this, and there's a whole raft of other issues that, not issues, but let's say lack of understanding, the way that storage works. It turns out that if you plug it into a different SATA port, it's probably no longer SDA anymore, right? Things that we know, you and I, and most of our listeners know, but you didn't know that at the time that you started playing around with it. So it was one of those things, like one of the things that we focus on the UI. We're so focused on the UI and how we have to get that right for the new users, as opposed to just like, hey, there's some fundamental gaps in passing on information to the new user. Like, I get that not everybody wants to do a file system deep dive, but like a little bit of a, hey, don't worry about this directory kind of blurb, and then like a read more for somewhat of a more technical answer might have gone a long ways to the panic of like, is it filling up my hard drive? Where's all the files going? I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile that, but it got me thinking that I've spent so much of my life in the Linux world that there's just stuff that I just know, right? I didn't necessarily go out to read about it. Maybe I did, but oftentimes I pick it up, like especially like the Btrfs stuff. I pick that up through osmosis from people like you who might have run through it before, or colleagues or whatever, and I hear the talk about it because I'm plugged into the community. So I just thought I'd open up the conversation of like, I'm interested to hear from the audience what sort of knowledge that you had that was kind of like a light bulb moment, like you knew this and maybe it surprised you that somebody else didn't know it, or it just, you had that reaction of like, oh, not even in a derisive way, but just you knew something backward and forward that you didn't even necessarily try to go learn, and it struck you that somebody else you were talking to didn't know that.
And then forced you to walk through it. So talk to me about this, Steve. There is a principle in education that says teaching is the highest form of learning. And so when you go to learn something, if I explain something to you, you can learn it. If I explain something to you and you write it down, we know that you'll retain more of it. If I explain something to you, you write it down, and then later you go back and read it or say it, we know that you'll retain even more of it. And if I explain something to you, you write it down, you internalize it, you read it back, you say it, and then you practice walking through it so that you can then go teach somebody else. That requires the highest form of learning. And the rationale behind that is, it's one thing to be able to write something down, but there's no real check and balance. It's another thing to be able to say it out loud. But again, not really in a check. There might be a check and balance, but it's only to yourself. You're only accountable to yourself. Once you have to go and explain it to somebody else, the I don't get it is going to be your sign that you don't get it either, right? And you'll have to find different ways and different analogies and work through it until you can effectively communicate an idea to somebody else. And when you can successfully accomplish that, we know a couple of things are true. We know that it has been internalized by you, and we know that you are less likely to forget that thing going on, because it's not so much rote memorization so much as a true integral understanding of a particular concept. As you were stepping through this, did you find points where you said to yourself, yeah, forcing myself to go down explaining this to this individual that needed my help caused me to learn it at a deeper level? Or was it mostly just, didn't know I knew that?
So I'm going to insert my shameless Red Hat plug here.
Please.
I think my department in particular and my boss really drives this idea into us that we do what's called the see one, do one, teach one. So what this means is when they
that's
send
a physician principle.
Sure. But it was the first time that I've heard it in technology. And the idea here is I go in and I do the thing for the client as they watch. Then they do it while I watch. Then they do it and they teach their colleague. And that is kind of our standard operating procedure in my department for when we are passing on technology to people. And it just reinforces essentially what you were talking about, how teaching is the highest form of learning.
Did you run into success with that with this individual that you were helping, or was it more along the lines of they just wanted it fixed, so you were trying to get to the end and it wasn't so much about teaching?
No, teaching. Well, so the answer is they're in the phase of I want to do it and I want to learn it, but I don't necessarily want to be taught it. And so that makes it some level of struggle, because you get the people that sometimes you get people who all they want you to do is affirm their thought process instead of giving them, like, not even giving them the right answer, but steering them in the right direction. It's like sometimes you talk to people and you hear what they say. They've asked you a question. You give them an answer or guidance, and then they ask their same question in a different way and multiple ways because they're trying to get you to say a thing. They're trying to get you to say the thing that they think that you were going to say, and so that they're gonna talk in circles until you tell them the thing. And those people don't necessarily want to be taught because they're not listening for the truth. That's too.
Let me throw something at you. You tell me if this resonates with you. They're not listening to understand. They're listening to be understood.
I'd say the first part is true. The second part is not. They're not listening to be understood either. They want you to tell them that the path they were going down was correct. Right? So they're not listening.
Good
to
news about bad
the
habits.
answer. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So here's a talk radio principle. So there's a talk radio principle that says that I can't really convince you of anything, right? The only thing I can do is water plants that naturally exist within you. So if I come and I'm trying to convince you that ZFS is just a way better way to go than ButterFS. It's just the bee's knees, and that's just the way. That's all file system. My gosh, ZFS, it's so amazing, and that's how I come into the conversation. And you come into the conversation with this idea that ZFS garbage. I'm a BTRFS guy. I even pronounce BTRFS right, and everybody else is. But it's that kind of thing. And you and I sit down across the table from each other. A talk radio principle would be, I can ask you questions about what do you like about BTRFS? Why do you think that's bad? And I can look for an opportunity for you to say, well, the only problem I have is I really struggle with support. Like it works for me and I really understand it. And I think it's the best thing since sliced bread, the best file system God ever created. But the one thing is, like, every time I ask my friends, they all are asking me, none of them know anything about it. And I never really can get anywhere. Oh, interesting. What do all your friends use? They're all using ZFS. Huh. Why do you think that is? Well, I don't really know. I guess a few of them said that they had really good success with it, that they've never lost it. And you see what you're doing. So what you're doing is you're not directly coming across the table to say, this, you're wrong and you should take this path instead. What you're doing is you're looking for opportunity. Now, if you ask those questions, I have no idea why my friends use ZFS. That's ridiculous. It's the dumbest file system ever. Loses your data. It's not supported. It's based on that Unix garbage. And then there was never a plant there to water. There's nothing you're going to say that's going to change that person's mind. And it's a fool's errand to try. And so the best course of action there is just kind of back off. And I wonder how much of that principle overlaps with what you're talking about when you're talking with somebody who they're not interested in, as you said, discovering the truth. They're just interested in hearing good news about their existing habits. There's no plant there to water. There's no opportunity for you to guide anywhere. So your only option then is, what I wouldn't do is water the plant in the wrong direction. Nobody can argue with silence. And so it makes it uncomfortable, but it can be an effective tactic to say, yeah, that's the Sahara. I go down this path and I don't know, it's weird. I can't really explain. Most people don't know what to do with silence. They have to fill it. And so it sucks the air out of the room for that particular path. And then sometimes, not always, sometimes it can open up a path to guide somebody in a different direction.
I think that today I learned, I was listening to you and I was like, that some of that is definitely resonating with me. I'll have to chew on that.
One other thing I wanted to talk to you about was this concept of architectures being different between Windows and Linux. So Linux has this concept, and it's one of the things that I think really shines well. So the basic premise, everything does one thing very, very well, right? And so when you're talking about a kernel, a thing that interfaces with hardware, if you were designing that from scratch and we were all sitting around a room saying, how do we design a kernel and how do we make it talk to hardware? The way that we would land on that is we would say, well, we want it to talk to all of the hardware. Everything that I plug in, I want it to be able to talk to it. What talk to it? Well, the kernel, because that's what is talking to the hardware as my interface. And it, unsurprisingly, does that very, very well. In the Windows world, you have a kernel, and it indeed talks to some hardware. And after the CrowdStrike incident, I'm sure that we're going to revisit how some of that works. But the reality is that there's a ton of stuff that is the way that it talks with hardware is by installing a software package on top, a driver. And then that thing goes and has the instruction set to talk to a particular hardware. And so what it has taught users is the operating system can't talk to anything. They're all just yellow question marks. And then once you get into the operating system, then you can install the specific instructions that you need to talk to whatever hardware that you have, because you wouldn't necessarily need the driver for every printer, just the one that's plugged into your computer. And so the first time they get into Linux and like, what do you mean it just works? Oh, you just plug it in, it just works. How does it just work? How do I install the driver? Well, you don't. This is a little bit embarrassing, and I'm kind of putting myself out there, but for the interest of the next person who comes along this path, the very first Linux class I ever took, one of the things I asked my instructor, in fact, the only thing I really wanted out of the class, when something doesn't work, when I plug something into Linux and it doesn't work, where do I get the driver? How do I install it? And I just assumed there has to be some place that you can download drivers. There's got to be a way to write a driver. Instructor was very patient, very gentle, very kind, but like, hey, it's not really quite that simple, right? First of all, writing instruction sets, absolutely a thing you can do. And if you are passionate, the kernel work is some of the most awesome things ever. But then he baby stepped me through it, right? Well, the kernel does that all on its own. And now with 20 years in hindsight, I look at that and I go, that's why I choose to run that operating system on my laptop, on my desktop, on the server, because it's the most efficient way for me to interact with hardware. And so I take a basic Linux distro, I add some user utilities, the software that I want to run on top of it. I use a tiling window manager, and I feel like I have a minimal viable computer to where I can just call a piece of software and it shows up on screen real estate and gives me the ability to interact with the keyboard, the mouse, and the monitor. And I'm curious if you bumped into those architecture differences where like this just works in a totally different way.
So one of the first things that we encountered was, so the computer is a little bit flaky due to aging hardware in spots. And one of the things we ended up running into was misbehaving computer. And I would get a text message like, did you log into my computer? Because it just kicked me out. And I was like, well, no, I didn't log into your computer, but even if I did, it wouldn't kick you out. Well, in Windows, anytime that you're on and somebody like remotes into your computer, like kicks you out. And then if you log back in, it'll kick them out. And like, well, it's a multi-user system. And even if I was logged in, I'd probably come in through SSH and it would be fine. He's like, well, you can't use the desktop at the same time. Like, no, you can. You could just fire up VNC or XRDP or whatever, and it would be fine. As long as your computer doesn't choke from resources, it'll be fine. So some of that, like we were talking about, drivers work differently. The fact that network names they look foreign to people until you understand how predictive naming works, how Linux is a multi-user system by default, and Windows had to learn how to do that for like Windows Terminal Server and stuff like that. Oh, really?
Yeah, no, you're right. It is kind of comical, right? 20-year head start, and we're and then they finally catch up, kind of a thing.
Well, I guess to be fair, it's a design decision because multi-user didn't come out of Linux, right? It came out of Unix. Unix was born as a multi-user system.
Absolutely. And anybody that's fought with Cal licensing or forget fighting with it, just trying to understand it, understands why that's not not a great thing. Okay, so here's something I came across this week, Steve, and I thought it dovetailed really nicely into your story slash discussion segment of, these things that we don't know that we know. This is something I had no idea. I'd never encountered it. And when I threw it past you, you're like, are you kidding me? That's like a staple for me. And it's the source command. So for somebody who has not used the source command, what is it? How do you use it?
So the source command is, literally is source or a period. So if you type the word source or just the period and space and then give it a path to a file, it essentially will use that file. What do I mean by that? Sometimes you need to load environment variables that you don't necessarily want to be loaded every time that you log into the computer. Or maybe you have a bash function. So a bash function is essentially like you give it a name. One of the things that's very common for a bash function to do is to do some sort of upgrade cycle. So you would type in, I don't know, pack up, and it would do pacman update, and it would do like -- force -yes -- replace, whatever it is, right? And it kind of works like an alias, although the function can do a whole bunch of other stuff because it makes some decisions. You might need to have environment variables. So one of the common ways to not have not have passwords show up in your history file is by having them in an environment file. So you have like username equals, and then your username password equals your password. And if you source that, what will happen is if you type env, so short for environment, you'll actually see a variable called username with the value you put in the file and password with the value you put in the file. And what that means is that you can reference $username or $password in any command you run on the command line without actually having the value of your password showing up in history. You follow me so far?
I do.
Sometimes I talk a little fast, especially one of those things like this is a complicated, it's complicated and not. If you've ever run into any of these concepts, it's not complicated to explain. If you've never used an environment variable or a shell function or those sorts of things, or shell aliases, sometimes it gets a little bit murky to understand.
You know what? Now that you say that, so why don't we dig into an environment variable? So, undoubtedly, somebody has gone into their bash RC file or has looked at the dot files inside of their home directory. But what does that mean? How does all that work?
So one of the most flexible ways that you can program is you create a variable. A variable is a substitute for making something hard-coded. So for example, when you log into a Linux system, there is a variable called shell. And being very, very basic about it, when someone tries to SSH into the session, it says, okay, go and load $shell so that it doesn't have the shell hard-coded into the program that's loading the shell. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so instead of hard coding like user bin bash or bin bash or dash if you're on Ubuntu, instead of having that hard coded, there is a variable called shell that runs or is referenced when you log into your box. If you typed env, you will see shell in capitals in there because that is defined by your user when you set it up on a normal Linux distribution. So environment variables are a way for applications to get information without hard coding them in, such as your shell version or the desktop session or what your favorite editor is, all of those sorts of things. And it's a placeholder so that all of these things can be changed by the user at will. And the environment variables are ones that are persistent across reboot. So they basically get loaded in at the time that either the computer starts or the user logs in, depending on the type of variable that it is.
Okay. So go back to the source command. How does that relate to environment variables?
So the source command essentially appends to that list of variables. So if you have defined a variable that you were sourcing. So the source file just basically says, read a specific file and execute that. So if the file has variables in it, it will put variables in your path. If the file has let's say it runs a script. So one of the, like a common thing is like maybe you source, is it fast fetch? You know, that pretty thing that prints out to your terminal with all of the like nice system information. You might have a source on a shell script that does that something fun with that. And so you'd source it and that would become part of your user session. So essentially the source command takes anything that is in a file that you are sourcing and puts it in your user session. So it could be a file, it could be a function, it could be an environment variable, and it adds it to your current session.
1-855-450-NOAH. It's 855-450-6624. The email live at asknoahshow.com. The number to join us, ask your questions, become a part of the program. So if people have not used the source command before or have played with it or heard of it, what is kind of the basic way to get started with it? What would you suggest somebody do to kind of play around and get? Would you start with Python?
So one of the things that we were talking about when I said, I use it all the time, is Python has this idea of virtual environments where you can install a version of Python and whatever esoteric weird packages that you want to support it into a directory. And then it will give you a file inside of that directory called activate. If you source the file called activate in your virtual environment, what it does is it makes sure that you are using the version of Python and all of its dependencies instead of the ones that are installed on your system, the ones that you've just made in a directory. So if I made this more simple, Noah, let's say you know nothing at all about Python. And I need you to run a Python program, and that Python program has some dependencies. Okay, you follow me so far?
Yes.
If you don't have permission to install dependencies on your system, one of the things that I can do is I can create a virtual environment, have all of the Python stuff in it that I need, tar it up, and I can ship that with my application, theoretically. When you untar that, you would then just type source and the activate, and then you have the Python environment that I need you to have in order for you to run my program.
But this is the important part, I've not installed anything on my system. I haven't modified my system. I've just teleported into what you're using.
Correct. There's nothing that gets installed in the system. You've just untarred something, and then the activate command just activates that virtual environment for you.
That's very cool. So we'll have links for that in the show notes. You can find those at podcast.asknoahshow.com. Anything else that we should cover by way of things that you took for granted? Anything you learned through the experience that you're like, man, I would want the next person to know this?
I think just being aware of when you have a gap. So if you're knowledgeable about a subject and you can talk about it like you and I do every week, and then you run into something that makes you pause because either you don't know how to describe it properly or you don't know how to, in my case, I speak fast and then I'm not sure if people are following me. And so I need to figure out how to slow down or say things more simply. If you run into those, that's the time for you to be able to learn, because if you're struggling to explain it simply, the general theory, not just with computers, with everything, is if you don't understand it enough to explain it simply, then you don't really understand the core concepts.
There's a NASA scientist, and he has one of my favorite all-time quotes. And it goes something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it goes something to the effect of, complicated ideas are good ideas that haven't had enough time to distill down into something elegant. And he uses that theory. So he's in charge. I'm kind of a space nut. I really enjoy watching NASA and them sending the rovers up to Mars and all of the immense challenges that come with, trying to control a robot on an 11-minute delay kind of a thing. And so anyway, all that to say, they have to design these robots that are going to go up to space. And in the case of this last mission, it's like a 4-part mission. One part is getting the robot up into space. The second part is getting it over to Mars. The third part is dropping it down and then getting the rover, to like helicopter out of this thing. Then the fourth part is getting the soil samples, and they got to get them all back home. And so they're going through all of these different things. And his design principle was, when we have something that's complicated, we need to distill that down because there's less points of failure. It's easy to understand. It's easier to troubleshoot. It's easier to replicate. And so he's really against complex ideas. And so, I mean, there's been phrases all along the way, right? Keep it simple, stupid. There's all sorts of things that emphasize this idea on elegance and simplicity and those sorts of things. You're just applying that to the concept of teaching, being able to, really smart people can take really complicated ideas and distill them down into something that a 5th grader can understand. And there's value in that. And what you're saying is, if you put more thought into it, if you put more time into analogies and other ways to grok that information and internalize it, you will find it easier to explain in simple terms. Am I picking up what you're laying down?
I think it's more that if you are struggling to put it in simple terms, like there are some things that are just really complex, but if you are struggling to put things into simple terms, it generally means that you haven't understood it thoroughly enough.
Yeah. Well, that's very cool, Steve. I really appreciate you sharing your experience. If there was a thing that you took away from it that you said, hey, this is what I'm going to do differently going forward, or this is something that I'm going to take and apply in other situations. I would imagine working with clients day in and day out gave you some of the tools to then approach this situation in your personal life.
Yeah, it did. To answer your question, I think I will consider the idea of watering the plant. That's a new one, and I'll see what I can do with that.
That's very cool. It's a talk radio principle, and it's funny because the same things that doing talk radio is kind of like herding cats. If I was trying to explain it right, you've got people that are all over the place with all manner of different information and all manner of opinion, and they all come to the table and then want a box. And so trying to keep all the cats in herd and keep them on topic and all those sorts of things can be a challenging thing. But learning that you can water the plants that you want to see, and you can starve the weeds of oxygen, and you can leverage both of those tools, it becomes a really effective way to guide conversation. With conversation comes change. And so I think there's probably a very practical way you could apply that in the technical realm when guiding people that have strong personalities and are convinced where this is the way to go, or this is not the way to go, or at least recognize where you're beating your head against a brick wall. Hey, there is no plant to water here, so this is not worth my time trying to do this. It's never going to be a fruitful thing. It's just going to be, for lack of a better way to phrase this, an exercise in frustration. And then that doesn't help anybody. Hey, the music in our ears, it means we're out of time. I thank you for joining us. We record this show live every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. You can listen by going to AskNoahShow.com. If you missed the live episode, it's okay. We publish it as a podcast all the way back to episode 1. You can find that at podcast.asknoahshow.com. There you'll find not only the entire back catalog of the show, but you'll also find the show notes, which contain oftentimes more than what we have time to get to in the show. We're back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central. AskNoahShow.com. You want to keep up to date with me on the latest? NoahC.us. We'll see you back here next week. Have a good week.